Shadow is a keyword ability that was introduced in 1997's Tempest. It comes with both upside and downside. A creature with Shadow can only be blocked by other creatures with Shadow, but a creature with Shadow can also only block creatures with Shadow. As you'd expect, this is a fairly aggressive mechanic, since in most situations a creature with Shadow is unblockable, but also can't block. Since originally appearing in Tempest Block, it has returned several times, and at this point there are 57 cards that either have or grant Shadow, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's look at the top 10 cards with Shadow. At number 10, it's Dauthi Mindripper. For 3 generic and a black, it's a 2/1 with Shadow, and whenever it attacks and isn't blocked, you can choose to sacrifice it to make the defending player discard 3 cards. So this Shadow creature is less about doing damage, and more about using Shadow to generate a fairly powerful effect. Making your opponent discard 3 is a 3-for-1 after all. It achieved its 1 Pro Tour top 8 at the Tempest Block Pro Tour, in a deck that was good at temporarily reanimating creatures with Corpse Dance. Because the Mindripper could put itself in the graveyard on its own, it wasn't hard to empty your opponent's entire hand by reanimating it and making them discard again on your next turn. Dauthi Mindripper hasn't managed any top 8 since 1998 though, and future Shadow cards are sure to bump it off the list. At number 9, it's Soltari Foot Soldier. Certainly the simplest Shadow card on the list, the Foot Soldier is 1 white mana for a 1/1 with Shadow. Obviously, if this can come down on turn 1, it can chip in for tons of damage over the course of a game. While it was in Standard, it was played in a deck with Anthem effects, like Glorious Anthem, amplifying just how hard it could attack. More recently, it's been played in Pauper White Weenie decks. Pauper is a format where only commons are legal. There, it's often outfitted with auras like Hyena Umbra, which not only make the Foot Soldier a better attacker, but also offer it some protection. It's been a couple years since it's seen play in Pauper though. At number 8, it's Soltari Visionary. For 1 generic and 2 white, it's a 2/2 with Shadow, and when it damages a player, you destroy target enchantment that player controls. So while it may be a little less efficient than some of the Shadow creatures on here, if you can pick off even 1 enchantment with it while it's hitting your opponent for 2 a turn, that more than makes up for that. It gained all of its points in the Standard of 1998, a format that was dominated by powerful enchantments, namely Survival of the Fittest, Recurring Nightmare, and Cadaverous Bloom. The format was so ripe with strong enchantments that it appeared in the main deck in that format's White Weenie decks. However, it's another card that has been idle for a very long time. It hasn't achieved a top 8 since 1998. At number 7, it's Dauthi Horror. For 1 generic and a black, it's a 2/1 with Shadow, and it can't be blocked by white creatures. That ability actually makes the Horror substantially more unblockable. We've already seen 2 white Shadow creatures in this video, and there are more of them in this top 10, so the fact that white creatures, even with Shadow, couldn't stop the Horror was pretty important. It was played in mono-black aggro decks in Standard and Extended, but doesn't have any top 8 since 2003. At number 6, it's Looter Il-Kor. So far, all of the Shadow cards we've seen on this list are from Tempest Block, but that's not so with the Looter. As with many mechanics, Shadow made a comeback in Time Spiral Block, and the Looter makes pretty good use of it. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 1/1 with Shadow, and when it hits your opponent, you get to draw a card, and then discard a card, or, in other words, loot. Because it has Shadow, you're likely to get a lot of looting done, and digging deeper in your deck and loading your graveyard can be a valuable thing, and indeed, it saw play in a Time Spiral Block constructed deck that could get some extra value out of those discards, because it was played alongside the much more famous Tarmogoyf, and by discarding cards with the right types, you could make sure Tarmogoyf was way too big for your opponent. It was also played alongside Call of the Herd, which you could still get an elephant out of even after you discarded it. It never gained any points outside of Block Constructed though. At number 5, it's Dauthi Slayer. For 2 black mana, the Slayer is a 2/2 with Shadow that has to attack each combat if able. Those words can often be substantial downside, since a small creature that has to attack no matter what is eventually going to attack in a disadvantageous situation. But because the Slayer has Shadow, it's much less likely to be a problem, especially because you're already likely to attack with a Shadow creature every turn anyway. It was played in mono-black aggro decks in Standard and Extended, often alongside Dothy Horror. It's also found significant success in Pauper, where it's been played in mono-black Devotion decks. It's nice having a creature this aggressive that also adds 2 black Devotion, so that when you play your Grey Merchant of Asphodel later on in the game, it's more likely to finish off your opponent, both because the Slayer has cracked in for a bunch of damage and helped Grey Merchant drain even more life. So far, it doesn't have a top 8 in 2024, but it's not impossible to imagine it finding more success in Pauper in the future. At number 4, it's Temporal Isolation, another shadow card from Time Spiral. This one takes shadow in a different direction. It's an aura for 1 generic and a white. It has flash and enchant creature, and it gives the enchanted creature shadow. It also prevents all damage that would be dealt by that creature. In other words, the creature you stick this on can't block, and while it probably also can't be blocked, it can't do damage, so it doesn't really matter. Basically, it's a roundabout form of pacifism. Because it has flash, you can sometimes block a creature and then flash this in and kill it too, since it got blocked before it had shadow. It saw play in a wide variety of decks in Time Spiral block constructed and standard, since if you were the beatdown, it got a blocker out of the way efficiently, and if you were a control deck, it was a reasonable way of removing most of the creatures that were threats. It also saw a bit of play in Extended, including in what I think is one of the sweetest top 8 decks ever, Spirit Stompy, a deck that looked to abuse Tallowisp to search up singleton auras that were good in the right situation, and Temporal Isolation was definitely one of them. However, Temporal Isolation hasn't top 8'd any significant events since 2008. At number 3, it's Shadow Rift. For 1 blue mana, it's an instant that gives a creature shadow until end of turn, and you draw a card. 1 mana card draw with smaller situational effects attached, often called cantrips, tend to be pretty nice in the right style of deck. This is because they automatically replace themselves, so if you can find a way to take advantage of the effect, you get some impressive value. While in Extended, it was played in Psychotog control decks. These decks look to stall out the game and eventually have a graveyard and hand so full of cards that the Tog could swing for lethal. Shadow Rift was perfect for the deck because it put itself into your graveyard and drew you a card, both of which meant more fuel for the Psychotog, and Shadow meant that if your opponent had a blocker, Psychotog still wasn't going to have any problem getting in for the killing blow. After rotating out of Extended, it went quiet for some time before finding a home in Pauper. There, it's played in what is basically a Pauper version of Psychotog. It's a control deck that uses Tireless Tribe as the win condition instead, with the plan being to buff the tribe's toughness a ton and then use Inside Out to turn that toughness into power. As with Psychotog, Shadow Rift makes it so you don't need to be concerned about the opponent having a blocker, and it gives you another card to fuel the tribe. Tireless Tribe decks are still a thing in Pauper right now, and that means Shadow Rift has a very real chance to claim the number 2 spot on this list in the near future. At number 2, I've included 2 cards because they would have both made the list and they're very similar, Soltari Priest and Soltari Monk. With 20 points, the Priest is a legitimate number 2, while the Monk would have been at number 7. In addition to being similar, the Monk was never played in any deck that didn't also include the Priest. For 2 white mana, they're both 2/1s with Shadow, and they each have protection. The Priest has protection from red, and the Monk has protection from black. They were both played in block and standard white weenie decks, but Soltari Priest saw a lot more play. This is partly because the Priest protection was far more relevant in a format that had Mog Fanatic in it. Soltari Monk could die to the little 1-drop, but the Priest couldn't, and there were lots of other really good red creatures in the format too. The Priest also got a reprint in Time Spiral's time-shifted bonus sheet, while the Monk didn't, and even 9 years after being originally printed, Soltari Priest was still worth playing in white aggro decks. Still, even the Priest hasn't put up a top 8 since 2007, and Shadow Rift is pretty much a lock to pass it in the near future. And at number 1, it's Dothy Voidwalker. By far, the newest card with Shadow to make the list. The Voidwalker is 2 black mana for a 3/2 with Shadow, and if a card would be put into opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you instead exile that card with a Void counter on it. You can tap and sacrifice the Walker and choose one of those exiled cards, and you can play it without paying its mana cost. Yeah. This is a super pushed Shadow creature. Not only does it hit hard as a nigh unblockable 2-drop, it also offers one-sided graveyard hate, and it lets you steal your opponent's cards. The Voidwalker is from Modern Horizons 2, which means the only 60-card formats it's ever been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but it has seen significant play in all 3, and a ton of play in both Modern and Legacy. It's been played the most in Modern, a format with lots of graveyard decks, and it's been particularly successful in Rakdos Scam. These decks look to abuse creatures with sacrifice effects by using Not Dead After All, and the Voidwalker is both good with this type of effect, since you can sacrifice it and get it back while stealing an opponent's card, and it's also good against this effect, since if your opponent has a Voidwalker, your creature can't be brought back by Not Dead After All. This has created an ideal environment for the Voidwalker, who also hates on a bunch of other graveyard decks in the format, and as a result, it's played in tons of black decks in Modern right now. It's also widely played in Legacy, where it has all the same utility it has in Modern, but with one important addition: it forms a 2-card combo with Helm of Obedience. The Helm lets you pay X mana, and then your opponent mills X cards, and only stops when X cards have been milled, or they hit a creature card. With Voidwalker in play, none of the cards ever go to the graveyard, so a single activation of the Helm mills an entire library. That's some sweet utility to have on a card that is already incredible in most black decks. Dauthi Voidwalker is going to be the #1 card with Shadow for the foreseeable future, but it isn't completely impossible for us to see more push Shadow creatures in future Magic sets. A few years ago, I don't think anyone ever thought there would be a Shadow creature as successful as Dauthi Voidwalker, for example. So who knows, maybe someday something will be printed that can rival it. So those are the top 10 Shadow cards in Magic. If you want creatures that are hard to block but can't block themselves, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including over 730 other MTG top 10s, including about 100 of them that have looked at different mechanics and keyword abilities, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.